Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for the event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap with lots of good information, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, just know you'll be able to watch it on demand afterwards. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time you have a question for our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll take a few minutes near the end of the presentation and go through those questions. And finally, we are going to be doing a drawing after today's presentation for 5 $50 Amazon gift cards. So good luck to everybody who is on today's webinar. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is Defending Against Account Takeovers, Developers' Best Practices. Our speaker today is Kevin Hanaford, who is Head of Information Security at Remitly. And he's going to be joined by James Wickett, who is Head of Research at Signal Sciences. Hi, Kevin. Hi, James. How are you guys doing?
Hey, doing good, Charlene.
Awesome, awesome. Well, James, I think you are going to be kicking us off, so I'm going to put myself on mute, turn it over to you.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm really excited to be here today. Signal Sciences is really happy to partner with Remitly, and I've been friends with Kevin for a while now, and we've been really excited to be kind of joining together. So I have a few slides here on Signal Sciences I'd like to cover real quick, and then Kevin's going to walk us through the bulk of that. Well, what is Signal Sciences? We're a next generation WAF and RASP defensive technology. We're designed to work with engineers, whether you're security, operations, or developers, to help overall increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing speed or scale like you've had to in the past. So one of the things we've seen on the next slide here is that web application attacks have been pretty much one of the major sources of data breaches over the last 5 years here. And we're still seeing the spending on web application security and web application type related attacks to still be a small percentage of the overall information security and defensive budget. So we see that as a real problem. On the next slide, we have one of the reasons we have this situation we're in is because we don't actually, we kind of look at the tip of the iceberg here. Like we're seeing the OWASP type injection attacks, the things we've had for the last 15, 20 years, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, that type of stuff. But real world problems are what we don't actually see, and we don't actually put that instrumentation in place in a lot of organizations over the last several years of application security. But things like Account Takeover, which this is going to be about here today. And so legacy web application firewalls really focus on those threats that are kind of 15 years old, which we think are still important, but we need to focus on more of the real world problems, and that's what Signal Sciences is really aiming to do. We'll talk more about this later, and some of the stuff that Kevin kind of gets into kind of functions on power rules. But one of the things we allow any of our users or customers to be able to do is to instrument any HTTP traffic flow and any type of the request and response, and be able to instrument that and get kind of get telemetry off of your application in ways that you never were able to before. This lets you kind of assimilate, like, what does an account takeover look like in my environment? What are valid traffic? What is invalid traffic? And then lastly, I just want to say, like, Signal Sciences, our big push is we can protect any application, whether you're running in Kubernetes or Amazon or Pivotal, any type of web server from Nginx to Apache, any type of language from Python to Go to Java, any type of attack. So we kind of have out of the box like the default OWASP injection attacks, but then we're also looking for brute force stuff, application DDoS, account takeover, bad bots. We also have virtual patching, and we hook into any DevOps tool chain. So from Slack to Datadog, VictorOps, PagerDuty, we hook to all those things, and we're able to kind of live inside of any tool chain you have inside of your organization. And my last slide here is just a is really, we're really excited about this. At the end of last year, we just won Gartner Peer Insights Customers Choice Award for what our customer, and these are a couple of quotes of what our customers are saying about us. The middle one there says, Signal Science is by far the only security product I've used that was not only simple to install, but also simple to use. We went from POC to purchase in just weeks, which usually takes months. And once we installed it, we instantly put the WAF into blocking mode, as it did such a good job without false positives. And that's that really kind of embodies one of the things that's really important about our product is we see our technology put in blocking mode in 95% of the organizations that we serve. And if you look at kind of traditional legacy WAF, that was 10, 15, 20%, depending on who you ask. So we're actually in real blocking mode with like some of the largest companies on the internet. We're looking at over 200 billion requests on a weekly basis, and we're just growing, and we're really excited about that. So, anyways, Kevin, it's been great partnering with you, and I want to turn it over to you, and that's the Signal Sciences piece.
Great, thanks, James. So real quick, this is your standard. First of all, hi, I'm Kevin Hanaford. We're going to go over this agenda really quick, standard webinar type of stuff, right? Intros, what account takeovers are and why they're such a problem, how we're defending against ATOs at Remitly, and then what to do when they're successful. And hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. As Charlie mentioned earlier, if you have questions, make sure to throw them in the chat, and we'll get to them as well. So first things first, like I said, introductions. A couple things. Remitly is a digital remittance company, so international money transfer, primarily regulated by moving money across borders. Makes us a little bit different than some of your like inter-country transfer apps like Square Cash or Venmo or anything like that. A little over 1 million customers worldwide. We did about $6 billion in transaction volume last year. And we have actually, it's been a while since I updated this slide actually, but we'll be close to 1,000 employees here shortly and nearly 1,200 worldwide by the end of the year. And then I put this mission statement up here because this is really what drives the company, is transforming the lives of immigrants and their families by providing the most trusted financial services on the planet. And just to speak to the culture a little bit, it's exactly what everyone at Remitly is trying to do. So next sort of thing, what exactly is a Kevin? Well, first of all, that's me. I'm the head of security, infrastructure, and IT at Remitly. Spent actually about a decade building and managing NOCs for various companies, Amazon, PayPal, Bungie, and Microsoft, split between Xbox and Office 365. Before I moved into security, I was kind of a natural progression in things that I was interested in. And a lot of that was just based on the stuff that we saw in NOCs, right? Kind of the quote unquote weird stuff led me to have a bit of a deeper interest and desire to get into the information security field. So that's what I've been doing for the last several years. Thinker, tinker, musician, photographer is kind of the tagline that I use for myself. I'm also a lover of all things coffee. Outside of work, I'm not really much of a tech person, if you will. I used to run a photography business. I've played in several bands, spent a lot of time trying to travel, do things with my wife and my kid, things like that. My day job is tech, it's information security, and yes, the security principles that I try to enforce at work follow me into my personal life. For anybody that's interested in contacting me after this, it's my email address, kevinh@remitly.com. Twitter handle is actually not Coffee Kevin anymore because I can't ever decide on what I want to what I want my Twitter handle to be. It's CMDKVN now. Kind of a little bit of a nerdier one. So let's shifting gears. Let's talk about why account takeovers are such a problem, and then how exactly we got here. So first things first, what are account takeovers? Account takeover is any successful attempt to gain access to an account that does not belong to yourself, the attacker, or whatever. Pretty broad generalization of how these work, but we'll get into a little bit finer detail in terms of what we're dealing with here at Remitly here shortly. But wanted to highlight a couple of really important sort of statistics around account takeovers. First of all, $5.1 billion in losses attributed directly to account takeovers in 2017. That's a bit of a conservative number, and this is according to Javelin Strategy. There's a link here in the slide here if you want to follow it. There's a bunch of information in that one as well as the second one from Twilio. That number is actually up 120% from 2016. And right out of the gate, if you're wondering, hey, why are these numbers so old? It's because the 2018 report is actually not out yet. So still waiting for that to update these numbers. But we do expect that to continue to increase in 2018 and 19. The amount of fraud committed based on data breach data that's 2 to 6 years old has actually increased nearly 400% over the last 4 years to $3.7 billion in 2016. Again, a number that we expect to grow. And I'll talk a little bit more about why ATOs are or have become such a big problem, but it has a lot to do with this 2 to 6 year old data breach information. Breaches get out, people don't change their passwords, it leads to ATOs. The speculation from Twilio, or the educated guess from Twilio here, is that by 2020 we expect $4 of every $1,000 in online payments to be fraudulent. And it's 0.4% at this point in time, but it used to be a negligible number. So the fact that it's growing, and it's growing so quickly, is obviously going to be a problem. And as e-commerce goes, becomes larger, we shift away from cash, people try to push into this digital currency type of world, it's going to continue to be a problem. So why would I take over an account? What's the upside for me? The first and actually largest objective in people that are trying to take over accounts, especially as it pertains to finance and finance technology, is fraud and money laundering. It's a really, really easy way, not easy. It's a less visible way than the old school way of laundering money, that you see in like Godfather or things like that. It's difficult for all companies to get the right kind of monitoring in place, the right kind of fraud and risk teams. We're relying on technology, which isn't perfect, right? So it's a growing, it's an evolving industry, but fraud and money laundering, definitely one of the, if not the top reason as to why people take over accounts. Second point here is, if I take over a bunch of accounts, or if I get access to usernames and password combos that are valid and work at different places, I can actually sell them as an attacker. I can turn around and sell that information. Generally, this is actually achieved by doing what's called credential stuffing, where I, as an attacker, go out and either purchase or acquire a list of potential username and password combinations. This may be from a breach. There's been several of those over the course of the last several years. Some of them obviously are very, very prominent in the media, things like that. But if I get a hold of those and then start to try to validate those against a company like Remitly or PayPal or Amazon or whatever, you can actually validate whether or not those credentials work. And then you take the valid ones and then you pass them off to somebody who's willing to pay for them. Credential cracking is a little bit less of a problem these days because most applications will rate limit just straight up brute forcing credential combinations. But the reality is it's still a problem, especially for some smaller shops that haven't maybe evolved their security programs to the point of doing things like rate limiting. This one's a bit of a controversial sort of viewpoint here, but the reality is we saw some of this in previous elections where we had both farmed accounts, so accounts that are just generated to look like humans, but also some accounts that were taken over and had some validity to them, had some historical data to them that made them seem like real people, and attackers would use that to spread some amount of disinformation. This happens obviously outside of elections. You can do this in any way, shape, or form, but the idea is if I can take over an account that has a valid history of me being a quote-unquote person online, then it's going to be more trustworthy for somebody who's receiving some information from this taken over account. And the last one is kicks and giggles. Everybody knows that attackers like to do things just because they can. The reality, that's never going away, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with. I wouldn't say it's the largest vector that we see, but sometimes they just do it. And the reality is it's challenging to tell when an attacker is actually doing things just for fun. It feels a little bit, Heath Ledger as the Joker-y, where it's sort of like, well, why did they do this? And we don't have any direct attribution to some sort of negative outcome. They just like to do it. I'm going to put this up here really quick. I'm not going to cover all of these things, but I do want to highlight some numbers according to Experian as to what I can get for different types of ATO data. I want to highlight, especially since Remitly is a fintech company, we process credit cards, and we have to comply with PCI and things like that. And the data around credit cards or debit card numbers it varies, right? So with just a card number, I can do a little bit of damage. It's not worth a ton. But if I have a card number plus a CVV number or full bank information, or what's called the fulls info, which is basically name, social security number, birth date, and some other things that would allow an attacker to potentially assume my identity online, obviously those things get a lot more valuable. And then things like passports, medical records, things like that. All of those have high value because attackers can do things with that, usually impersonating people online. So ATO data, very valuable. It's very, very important to be protecting it because you can have widespread ramifications for your customers or your end users if that information ever gets out. So why are account takeovers such a big problem? And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I throw this XKCD comic up here that pretty much everybody has seen, but the reality is we went from a world where we didn't have passwords to everyone's passwords were just the word password or some combination of my name and my kid's birth date or whatever. And then we evolved from that into this sort of first panel here, the Troubadour panel, where we're replacing letters with numbers and adding a bang and a 2 at the very end of our password, things like that. They're just not really great password hygiene. If you haven't seen this XKCD comic before, I recommend looking it up. It's pretty interesting. But the reality is here, when I have passwords for every single one of my online accounts, and at this point, I've been on the internet for forever, and so I have 300 or 400 whatever accounts. How do I remember all of them? And this is the years before password managers became a thing. I just had one password for everything. The problem there is that it's difficult to change my passwords at every one of these sites. It takes a decent amount of effort. Maybe I don't have the kind of time, things like that. So I'll leave it. I, as an end user, will leave my password the same in kind of all these places just out of convenience. And that obviously becomes a problem when you have a major breach from a company like Tumblr or LinkedIn or one of the larger breaches that have had lots and lots of users. These passwords then get out there and all of a sudden they're valid at all sorts of different sites. Second point here, compliance. So there are a number of compliance frameworks that have recommendations or requirements around how passwords should be structured, how frequently they should be reset, things like that. I'll highlight specifically PCI is one of the reasons why we have this, at least 8 characters, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 symbol, 1 number, and then reset every 90 days. It was a good stab originally at trying to alleviate this problem where everyone had passwords like password 123 and never changed them. The reality is what's ended up happening is now as humans have to change their password every 90 days, 4 years on end at many of these places, it starts to get difficult for people to remember those passwords. And again, highlighting password managers here is a good way to support this. But the reality is over time, the passwords get easier to guess and they get more predictable. People do things like instead of password 123, now it's password 1234. And then my next one will be password 12345. And an attacker knows that, right? They know how to take advantage of kind of the way the human brain works, and they'll realize patterns like that. The last sort of thing here is this: I don't matter, so why should my passwords? The reality is there's not anybody that doesn't matter from a password perspective. I've had this conversation several times with people who don't think they're senior enough at various companies, or they don't think that, oh, well, if an attacker got a hold of my account, they wouldn't be able to do much. And I'll highlight a specific example here is, I had an EA one time, an executive admin told me one time that she's not important enough for her accounts to matter. And so my counterpoint there was, well, as an attacker, if I'm able to get a hold of your account, I can now influence the CEO or the executive, whoever that you're supporting, to do things because you are a trusted entity. So the reality is there's not anybody here that doesn't matter. Everybody matters when it comes to passwords and password management. Second reason why password or account takeovers are such a big problem is desensitization, right? These two things did not age very well. So the Marriott data breach and Equifax thing, there's been lots of big breaches since then, even though I've only been giving this talk for 4 to 6 months. The reality is breaches only happen on days that end in Y. They're happening all the time. You constantly hear about them. We're getting to the point where we have this breach version of alert fatigue where, oh, well, here's another breach. It happened again. Even recently, earlier this week or last week, Facebook was in the media again for storing usernames and passwords in logs. Not quite a breach, but again, it's becoming one of these things where we just hear about it so frequently that we're getting desensitized. And then you have these giant breaches like Equifax that are followed up by little to no consequence. If you've been following the Equifax story, they had some pretty damning sort of conclusions coming out of the Senate committee hearing on that, and we still haven't seen anything. So, what do you do in terms of incentivizing these companies to take security more seriously if this is what happens, right? Nothing happens as an outcome. Then last sort of section is bad people, right? Everyone's favorite movie, you either love or you hate it, Hackers, but The reality is we have a couple of these things here, right? So there'll always be bad actors. There's never not going to be somebody who, like I mentioned previously, is just doing this for kicks and giggles. But also there's the hacking portrayal in media, right? If you talk about this movie Hackers or something that's even more recent, more relevant, like Bad Robot, you have these people who are the quote unquote hackers, or at least the way the media wants you to view them, that are being positioned as the protagonist, right? The people you root for. And so it makes attacking things look cool or feel cool, or like I have an obligation to society to do this. The reality is you don't really want to incentivize that, but it makes for good, certainly makes good for good TV. And so we see a lot of that happening as well. So switching gears a little bit on everybody here, I'm going to talk about how we're defending against ATOs specifically at Remitly. And I do want to say that some of these recommendations work for many people. Some of these recommendations work for very specific types of environments, things like that. Obviously, I'm willing to answer any questions anyone has about this, but I'm going to talk about this specifically in the vein of what we're doing at Remitly. The first kind of category of things we're doing is customer-facing defenses. I put this here first, multi-factor authentication, for a reason. I'm starting to come to this opinion that there should be no service that doesn't offer multi-factor authentication, and even fewer services that don't enforce it. The reality is at Remitly, we actually do enforce multi-factor authentication for all of our customers, with an exception of a small group of specific customers that I'll talk about in a minute. But that's actually been helping a lot when we're talking about account takeovers. We will sometimes see, potentially a successful login, but they'll always get gated by multi-factor authentication, and that stops an attacker. There's nowhere for an attacker to go after that unless they have the end user's phone, and then it's a different type of attack. One that's either very targeted or much less successful, things like that. So the vast majority of these ATOs are getting stopped just by virtue of having and enforcing multi-factor authentication. Another thing we do at Remitly specifically, because our customers are primarily using the mobile apps, is we are able to do some amount of device registration. So we can see which devices a customer is using to log into and transfer money using Remitly. And when we use some of that information to do a little bit of correlation here, if one customer signs in and uses their phone every month for years, and then all of a sudden they're using a different phone in a different country, that looks unusual to us. And so device registration actually does help a lot with those kinds of things. Also, I want to highlight a couple of different customer services teams that we have. We actually have a dedicated risk and fraud team that does sidelines transactions for risk reviews and fraud reviews. We spend a lot of time and energy and effort on that team to make sure we're doing the risk reviews right. We don't want to sidelining transactions that shouldn't be, and that we're protecting our customers from potential fraudulent activity, things like that. Then we have our care team. It's actually a team that will actually reach out directly to our customers in order to support some of these activities that like the risk or fraud team are doing, or following up with customers who have potentially poor experiences, things like that. So we've noticed a lot of really, really good upside by having a team that does these kinds of things. And our customers have been really receptive to it. They've really liked having that kind of sort of personal touch. And then we're also bound by EKYC, so know your customer, and then the anti-money laundering requirements. We're a company based in the United States, so we have to comply with U.S. Treasury, the FinCEN stuff, as well as FINRA. And those requirements, actually, to add a note, there are sometimes they're a little bit arduous, but the reality is they're all in place for the sake of protecting customers, which for us, that's our number one goal, right? We're a very customer-centric company. We want to make sure our customers have the best and most trusted experience. And so we have no problem complying with those regulations. So switching gears to the tooling side of things, I want to talk about edge defenses. In our environment, we actually use proxies for everything that's publicly facing. So we don't have any. Sorry, let me asterisk this. We don't have any servers that are publicly facing, with some very specific exception, but everything else goes through the proxy. And what that allows us to do is minimize our attack surface, right? We only have a couple of different points of ingestion that we need to monitor very heavily. Obviously, we watch everything else, but the reality is when all traffic's coming in through just a few select places, it makes it easier to monitor. Put up here WAF, signal sciences, right? So James mentioned earlier, we don't know each other for a long time. One of the quotes on that previous slide actually was a quote from myself. Shouldn't be that super hard to deduce given that the titles are exactly the same. But the reality is Signal Sciences actually does a lot for us. And I'll talk more about what we're adding to the Signal Sciences flow in our environment. But we get this kind of visibility out of having WAF like Signal Sciences, where we can see what's going on from a request header perspective, what kind of abnormal traffic are we seeing. It gives us some of the information we need to do some of the correlation down the line, or even at the edge at our proxy layer. Proof of work is, again, like I said, it's a unique thing to Remitly, although we've been getting quite a bit of positive feedback on this. What we're essentially doing here is we ran into, we have a very friendly attacker that likes to frequent Remitly. We saw for about 3 months last year. We saw them earlier in 2017. We've seen them periodically here and there, just repeat offender, if you will. Mostly automated, scripted account takeover types of attacks. And so what we did is we actually implemented a proof of work challenge where instead of it's not like it's similar to like the same categories like reCAPTCHA or the Google CAPTCHA stuff. But the reality is we actually send a challenge out to devices when they're trying to get a hold of Remitly or contact or request anything from the Remitly app or the website, and then make the device itself complete some challenge. It adds a little bit of latency to the whole transaction process, but not enough that customers will notice, but it does de-incentivize automated attacks. So it's been a really interesting one. We rolled this out in production at the beginning of the year, and we have seen far fewer automated attacks as a result of that. Next thing here is we call it a pre-validation service, but essentially just request enrichment. And this is what I wanted to talk about from the Signal Sciences perspective. So Signal Sciences gives us a bunch of visibility into request headers already. And what we're doing is as those are coming through, we're taking additional information from some services on our backend, and we're attaching those to the headers themselves. And then we can actually spit that out into our risk and fraud services, as well as take additional actions within Signal Sciences to do things like flag specific types of requests or potentially block certain combinations of things. So this has been a really interesting thing too. We just turned this on in February as well. It's been great. As much request enrichment as we can get, the better we are able to more granularly tune our rules. So that's been really, really helpful. I have a question. I'm getting these chat questions. Should I answer these inline, or should we wait till the end to answer these?
Why don't we go ahead and we'll just wait till the end. You can go on with your, okay.
Great, thank you. And then the last sort of thing here, lots and lots and lots of request logging. I throw a couple of these things up, right? Elasticsearch, Kibana, FluentBit, or FluentD, sorry. We like to have data. Data is good. Data helps us make educated decisions as to whether or not we should or should not block or temporarily or permanently block certain types of requests. This obviously gets a little bit unwieldy if you're not careful about how you're doing that, and you don't want to just log everything for the sake of logging everything. You want to have an educated approach to what you decide to log. So I talked or mentioned this a little bit earlier, but behavioral monitoring is something that we care a lot about here at Remitly because it helps us make those decisions around whether or not we should be blocking certain types of traffic. So things like login attempts from different devices and locations, or things like switching from two older browsers and operating systems from what we would expect to see. I highlight both of these things because our customers they follow similar behaviors most of the time in their processing transactions. So you'll typically only see a customer log in from their iPhone every single time and transact, or from the web app and transact. And they'll always be, or for the most part, they'll generally be in the same location. So when we start to see things like not logging in from the iPhone that they usually use, but they're logging in from an Android device or from a web device, and it's in a different country, we start to see things that are not necessarily normal. Doesn't mean we block them right out of the gate, but the reality is it is a signal, so you can take a look at it and say, oh, is this actually a customer, a legitimate customer transaction, right? If 5 minutes ago this person was transmitting money from the United States to the Philippines on their iPhone, and then fast forward 5 minutes, now they're transmitting money from a web browser to Nigeria or something like that, it's probably not the same customer. And so we use those signals as ways to tell like whether or not something nefarious is potentially going on. Switching to older browsers and operating systems is actually an interesting one that we started seeing when we had this sort of automated attack. They were using different or older user agents, so things like very, very old versions of Chrome, or I think we even saw Windows 95 user agent once or twice. So things like that, you just don't expect customers to be doing things like that. Another one that we see frequently here is people changing addresses. Humans move, they don't stay in the same place all the time, so changing addresses is something we obviously do on the sport and we actively encourage. But if you change an address multiple times throughout the course of the day and they're all different, and or you change your address immediately before sending a transaction, that's going to automatically get flagged by risk and fraud services because it's not an expected or normal behavior. Frequently changing passwords is another one we see. This is kind of an interesting one because we do have some security conscious users where every time a big breach comes out, they'll go and change their password. But if we're having customers that are changing their passwords or attempting to change their passwords multiple times a day or multiple times a week, it's again not usually something you would expect because usually customers aren't trying to add the friction to their own workflow. And so that again gets flagged as a signal as well. And then multiple failed login attempts. This is the real obvious one. We watch success rates and failure rates on off, as well as multi-factor authentication challenges. And so we measure the ratio between success and fail rates, as well as the actual numbers themselves. So we do track that. Once if we see spikes in failed off or login attempts, that's another signal we use as well. And then again, unusual login and logout patterns. Kind of talked about this a second ago, but sometimes we'll see somebody who will log in, transact, and immediately log out. Some of our customers do that. Most of them don't. So if you see that a lot, or you see multiple login and logouts in one day, it might be indicative of something else as well. And to kind of summarize all of these things, like I mentioned earlier, these are unique to Remitly, and they're not necessarily ideal to use in a vacuum. You don't want to use just one of these behavioral monitoring data points. You want to combine them with other things, do some of the human correlation engine, or potentially like technology correlation as well, to help understand what real customer transactions or data looks like, and what the potential attacker transactions look like as well. So good versus bad, I'm going to actually show all these at the same time. There's two kind of categories that go alongside this behavioral monitoring piece, right? So the good that looks bad, things like security conscious users who are frequently changing passwords or logging in and logging out, and then update laggards, right? So people who don't frequently update operating systems or don't frequently update browsers, you start to see like, oh, well, this browser is 4 or 5 versions old. Is this still legitimate? Just because it doesn't look great or ideal from a security perspective doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad traffic. And on the flip side of that, there's also bad traffic that looks good. So low volume, consistent login attempts, right? Somebody tries to log into a given account once a day. Seems pretty normal, but if it's once a day for 3 or 4 months, that's probably not normal. Or headers with unnecessary components, right? So when we were dealing with this automated attack last year, the headers that the attacker was sending to us were evolving over time. And they were looking more and more like actual real legitimate customer traffic. But some of them would just include things as sort of like a throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. So strange cookies or headers that we don't send across, or there's not in our app to do. And so modifying headers isn't impossible, but every once in a while we'll see things with unnecessary components, and that usually from our perspective is bad traffic that might look good if you didn't otherwise have that kind of visibility. So the question here is what to do when ATOs are successful. And I say when ATOs are successful, not if, because it's a poor approach to say that, well, I don't think that we're ever going to have to deal with account takeovers, or even if we do a deal with account takeover traffic or attacks, they're never going to get in. The reality is you want to take the approach that somebody is already in the network, or somebody already has successfully taken over account, and then develop a plan around that for when you do identify those things. Main heading here, just be quick, be decisive, and be transparent. I cannot iterate this enough or reiterate this enough. Every time we've seen a major breach fail in terms of their communication is because the company has not done one or all of these things, right? They were too slow to respond, they were not decisive enough, or they weren't transparent enough, right? And the last of which is really, really important from a customer perspective, because that will have a very high effect on the trust a customer has in you and your company and your services, especially as it comes to security or privacy. So reset passwords, right? If an account takeover is successful, the first thing you can do is immediately force reset password on your for your customer account. Yes, it'll add friction. Yes, it's going to be inconvenient, but the reality is if you take that access away from the attacker, they're less likely to be able to do anything on behalf of the customer. Your customer will understand if you go to them and say, hey, we reset your password because we saw some nefarious activity, or we wanted to be cautious about your account or something like that. Like I said, yes, inconvenient, but they'll appreciate the attentiveness to the security. Halt or cancel transactions. This is not possible in every single transaction type, especially in the finance world. Some transaction types, they kick off immediately or very quickly, and so you don't really have the ability to cancel them, or your ability to cancel is limited. But again, if you identify account takeover traffic and there are any transactions that are in flight, or you have the ability to cancel or halt them or stop them in any way, shape, or form, just do that. The worst case scenario is you halt or cancel a legitimate transaction, and yes, that would be inconvenient as well. But you don't want to take this approach where you're not halting transactions in order to facilitate the customer experience, and then have it turn out to be fraudulent activity or something like that. This point here, be cautiously overly prescriptive. This one came from, I was reading up on one of the breaches that happened last year. At this point, I honestly don't remember which one, but the company I was reading about had talked about resetting passwords specifically for accounts that they were able to validate had been taken over. And that misfired for them, right? They didn't get enough of the accounts. They didn't have the right query or something like that. And they reset a large portion of the accounts that that had been breached, but not this other smaller section of it. And then attackers for weeks were able to continue to use those accounts. The reality is, again, if you're resetting passwords, take a look at everybody you think it is. And if you are not confident that you may not be resetting passwords for unaffected users, again, it's some added inconvenience, some added friction, but those customers are generally going to be appreciative. Hey, we took this step to protect your account or add security to your account. Turns out we're overly prescriptive, but they want to hear that you care about their security and their privacy and the safety of those accounts. And so I say be cautiously overly prescriptive because it's the only way you can do it, as opposed to undershooting and then potentially not getting some attack traffic. Then I say tell your users quickly. We hear time and time again where a specific type of attack or a breach has happened and companies wait months to tell their users, and the immediate reaction is, well, why didn't they tell us when they found out? Or, well, why did I have to find out from the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever? The reality is you as a company need to get ahead of any of these types of attacks if they are successful. You want to figure out what happened and what you're going to do about it, and then you tell your users. Be transparent. Be the company that goes out and says, hey, something happened, and here are the things that we did to protect your account. Here are the things we did to respond to this something. And then if you have any other questions or information, feel free to contact us. What you don't want is customers going to other people that are not you in order to get answers. And so by telling those users or by telling your customers quickly and efficiently and being transparent, you're able to stop some of that, right? And retain some of the trust, even if a breach is particularly large. And then, like I said earlier, be prepared for ATOs to happen, because they will. The reality is the account takeover attack pattern shifts as it needs to, right? As technology changes, as we add new additional defenses and things like that. But the reality is you have to have a playbook or some sort of response plan for when these kinds of things happen. And I say ATOs, but reality is the same kind of playbook or plan can be applied to different types of scenarios. If you have that playbook, especially if you practice it or review it quarterly or annually or whatever, you'll be better equipped to respond more quickly and more decisively and more transparently in that case. I want to highlight the TimeHop breach and Core breaches that happened last year as good responses to breaches. I won't go into a ton of detail, but the reality is both of these companies did exactly that. They identified the attacker, they identified what the root cause was, they put in place security measures, did things like reset accounts, and then they turned around and told their customers, and they were very transparent about it, to the point at which TimeHop even actually covered this in an RSA talk this year. So those are good examples of companies that were very transparent, they were very quick, they were very decisive for their customers, and the reality is they didn't really see any huge fallout. They probably lost some customers, probably lost some users as you would expect, but they didn't have the big media blow up that you talk about, like with like Equifax or the Marriott breach, things like that. And it's because they went on and did that. I believe that's it. So quick short talk on Account Takeovers, and it sounds like we have a couple of questions that I should be able to answer.
Yeah, we've gotten a couple questions in, but there's plenty of time. If you have a question for either Kevin or James, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. Okay, your first question is, let's see, for any, let's see, I totally get that preventing ATO requires a multi-pronged approach. MFA, effective password management, and change enforcement. But aside from the methods and tooling you mentioned, what indicators do you look for at the web app layer? And then do you monitor specific test steps in the login or password reset processes that users go through?
Yeah, great question. We actually at Remitly very granularly monitor quite a few things that have to do with the login flow. And this actually originally came from, this is several years prior to me starting at Remitly, but this monitoring was put into place actually to understand what the friction points are in the login flow, as well as the transaction sent flow and things like that. And we use that to actually inform a lot of our product decisions. And so fast forward a couple of years later, when I joined and we started building up the security program, we started to use those exact same metrics in terms of like, where is customer drop off at each different step, what are the kinds of behavior that we're seeing, and those same sort of friction points. Some of those things are security things, right? So like, is it the right password? Are you being prompted for MFA in the right way? But yeah, we actually do monitor nearly every single step in the login flow, as well as the transaction send flow, to understand how far customers are getting, and then what types of behavior that we're seeing there. Sometimes we'll see customers who log in and get most of the way through a transaction. So they'll go all the way through the login flow and then all the way through the transaction flow to the point of where they're about to hit send transaction, and then they'll cancel out and back out. And then we'll see them go through a different flow or try to set up a different user or things like that. And that one is interesting because we do see, customers coming in and testing the app itself just to see, how does it work? What does the send flow look like? But in the event of, potential attacker, they're going to be doing the same things. And sometimes what we'll see is an account that may have been taken over as a result of one of these breaches. They'll go all the way through and attempt to, or not attempt to, but get all the way to the point where they're going to send a transaction to a regular customer of that account or a regular recipient of that account. And then they'll back out and they'll add a new recipient, new address, different country, and they'll try to process that. And so we actually do use those kinds of, so that's sort of like juxtaposition or user behavior analysis to understand, well, this is not normal for them to all of a sudden add, if they're always sending money to recipients in the Philippines or India, and then they add a recipient in Vietnam, or they add a recipient in a European Union country. It's not normal. It's just not something we expect. And so we do monitor for some of those sort of drastic changes.
All right, great. Okay, if you guys have a question, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. Right now, we don't have any questions in, so while we're waiting to see if we do get any more in, would like to remind the audience that today's event is being recorded. So if you miss any or all of it, or if you just want to listen to it again, you will have the opportunity to. We are going to be sending out an email at the end of today's presentation that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. Okay, we just got a new question in. Do you alert on specific behaviors, such as X number of bad logins over a particular time frame? And is there a playbook you have to trigger certain protective actions when certain questionable things happen?
Yeah, great question as well. We do alert on lots of that sort of escalating threshold type of behavior. So one of the things actually, and we get this out of signal sciences actually, is this sort of cascading or building types of thresholds. So you'll see, 10 logins in an hour is one threshold, and then that'll escalate to 10 logins in a minute, which will escalate to 10 logins in a second. And a lot of that actually helps us identify and block automated attack traffic. So we do monitor and alert on things like logins. The MFA prompts we actually alert on as well, because that's an interesting one. We don't want to depend on. We basically take this approach that at some point in time, some of our customers are probably going to be compromised, not from a Remitly perspective, but because they're involved in other breaches. And that's just the nature of some of these breaches, and what I mentioned earlier with the same passwords everywhere. So we don't want to depend on that never being the case with our customers. So we individually monitor and alert on the off attempts or successes or failures over time, as well as the multi-factor prompts or challenges over time as well. If you're able to log into an account and generate those multi-factor prompts, it's the same sort of deal, right? We want that to escalate over time, and we want to care about it when they get above a certain threshold. We also look at things like sustained login failure rates over time, particularly because we have occasional really high peak volume times when specific world events happen. So I'll highlight a very specific example. In November, I think, of last year, the rupee exchange rate was at the best it's been in years or something like that. And so we saw a huge increase in logins from customers who are sending money back to India. And what that ended up happening was all these customers who haven't logged in a long time, we started seeing that off failure rate go up. But we saw the auth success rate go up as well. And so we, like I mentioned earlier, we monitor this ratio, and it helped us look at it and say, oh, what's going on here? Is there something happening with driving this? Is it attack traffic, whatever? The reality is, given that we did set off the off failure alert, and we got paid for that subsequently, we were able to compare that against the success rate as well, and then also the multi-factor success and failure rate, and the ratios that we expect for all of those things. We're able to pretty quickly figure out, well, this is not attack traffic, this is normal traffic. So why is it happening? And then very quickly afterwards, we realized that there was that exchange rate situation. So it actually did alert us faster than our marketing team actually told us that they pushed a nice email around the exchange rate thing, but we were able to pick that up earlier than they even told us. So that was really nice. A certain playbook to trigger when you have some protective actions. Yeah, so we actually don't we don't do a lot of automated response around these things yet. It's something that we're looking into, and we have a couple of automated response playbooks that are in monitor mode, if you will. Basically, anytime an automated response would happen, it'll just send us an alert as opposed to taking that action. I like the idea of automating responses for certain things, but I feel more strongly about if there is a situation in which you could have an automated response, the vast majority of cases you can actually build a feature or functionality to solve that for you. And so therefore you don't really have to have kind of your templated sort of traditional knock types of automated responses. So we do a little bit of automation response there, orchestration, but for the most part, err on the side of just changing or building our features or our services or tools in the way that will solve for those automated responses.
Okay, all right, great. Got a couple more questions in here. MasterCard bought a company that tracks user sign-on touch patterns and force. Do you track user mobile app touch pattern as part of the signals?
That's another great question. The security team does not currently. We have some tools that our product team uses that track essentially user behavior. How easy is the app to use? Are people struggling to do that kind of thing? We have started talking to the product team about how we can adjust some of that, but the reality is we just haven't gotten there yet. I really do like the idea of understanding that, especially because that would very obviously highlight automated types of attacks where you're not going to see the sort of more humans scrolling around pressing buttons kind of thing. So it would be a really interesting user behavior to monitor, but yeah, we're not there yet.
Okay, all right, great. Next question, do you use your proof of work strategy on every request or only on those that meet certain criteria?
Yep, another great question. We only use it on certain types of requests right now. We've only had it in production for a couple of months, and so we specifically use it on any login attempt, any MFA attempt, and any, I believe, send transaction flow. So definitely not everything we do. But what we want to do is put them on the highest risk flows first, see how that works out, and then move forward on to putting those on other flows as well. So far, we've had a really, really good response. We've done a ton of dog fooding on it, which, just testing our own service. And the increased latency that you would expect to see in a proof of work type of challenge is not great enough that a human can notice it. But like I said, it's really there to de-incentivize the automated hack traffic. So it's had a lot of a really solid ROI for us without negatively impacting the customer experience at all, which that's been great.
All right, great. Well, that is all the questions that we have. I'm going to give the audience another minute or two to go ahead and get any questions that they have kind of lingering out there. Go ahead and get those in. While we're waiting, I want to go ahead and do the winners for today's 5 $50 Amazon gift cards. And let's go ahead and start the drawing for that. Our first winner for the $50 Amazon gift cards is Anamika Mukherjee. Congratulations, Anamika. Our next winner is Mahima, looks like Kalra. Congratulations, Mahima. Next winner is Claude Noshpitz. Congratulations, Claude. Our next winner is Roland Lasher. Congratulations, Roland. And our final winner is JD Fesser. Congratulations, JD. Congratulations to everybody who won today. If we didn't pull your name, join us for another webinar, and you'll be automatically entered as long as you show up. Okay, it looks like we have no more audience questions. So at this point, I'll go ahead and close out the Q&A. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Looks like we got one more. Sorry. At Remitly, ATO is probably pretty easy to make a business case. Do you ever see people that have limited exposure to this, and how do you get ATO defense rolling there?
That's an interesting question. I've talked to a couple of people who are starting to deal with increased account takeover attacks, and maybe not necessarily specifically account takeovers, but similar sort of automated, credential stuffing or cracking type of attacks. It kind of depends. So I think the real challenge is whether or not your executive team or your board or both take a very security-centric approach to their product. I'm navigating my answer for this a little bit politically, but the reality, the reality is, like, yes, you need to make a business case that aligns with business objectives. Like, the security team, yes, is here to make sure customers and your environment are secure, but you work for a company, so your justifications for anything need to be in line with business objectives, in line with business strategy, things like that. If you don't have a very security-centric sort of strategy at the company, yeah, it's going to be a challenge. But the reality is, you can almost always draw things like ATOs or ATO attacks back to dollar impact, so revenue loss or revenue impact, things like that. I typically recommend starting there, especially if there is not a very warm welcome to a security program or team at your company. You can say, like, well, if we have X number of account takeovers or X number of successful fraudulent transactions or whatever, it's going to turn into this much of a dollar impact to the business. And that's usually a pretty clear way of getting executives or board attention, especially if it, the larger that number gets. And I say that, and I want to caveat with, don't make up numbers or exaggerate numbers. It doesn't have to be a huge number. It just has to be, something larger than a couple $100. Like, if you really can truly say that fraudulent activity will only result in a couple $100 worth of revenue impact, then your security program is probably a lot better than most people's. But if it's like, oh, it's going to be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions, right? That'll get executive attention really, really fast. So trying to draw any security problem back to specifically a business strategy, and then even further to a revenue or contribution, profit or loss sort of metric, that'll get attention of the board or your executive team pretty quickly.
All right. Okay, well, now we definitely don't have any more questions. So I do want to
No
thank
worries.
everybody who did who did submit questions. And if you have a question that you don't think of during the webinar, but you want to get in touch with the folks at Remitly or Signal Sciences, Kevin, is there an email or something that folks can use to get more information?
Yes, actually, let's say at the very beginning of the webinar, but it's just kevinh@remitly.com.
Okay, all right. And James, Signal Sciences contact?
Yep, you can email me, James at signalsciences.com, or we also have our Modern Security series of Modern Security at signalsciences.com, and happy to get back with you.
Awesome. All right. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for giving such a great presentation. And as I said before, the webinar is going to be on demand. We'll be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. It's also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And while you're there, hopefully take a look around. Hopefully there'll be one or two other webinars at least that pique your interest. I guess that is all for me. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.